Alanna Chambers is a registered dietitian, a certified diabetes educator, and certified pump trainer from Kelowna, BC. She has focused her career on type 1 diabetes and technology, where she has worked and volunteered in a variety of settings within the diabetes space across the country. She now focuses her practice on technology training and education for both people living with diabetes and healthcare professionals. Lana has been honored to actively work on recent Diabetes Canada initiatives, including the upcoming clinical practice guidelines update on type 1 diabetes. Having lived with type 1 diabetes for 30 years, she understands that daily management takes just as much creativity and art as it does science. In her spare time, she is grateful to spend time with her supportive husband and their three adventurous daughters. Lana, I'll hand it off to you now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Caleb. It's such a treat to be back at the with this T1D Huddle group. It's been a while since I've done a session here. So thank you all for joining and taking some time out of your evenings. It is always a treat to get to spend some time with a fellow group of type 1. So I hope that this evening can be interactive. Please stop, ask questions, raise your hand, type in the chat. This is for you, and I want you all to learn from the session and from each other, especially on this topic when it comes to food. The one thing we know is that I'm going to share a lot of the research on it, but there is so much variability from person to person. So what each of you share is incredibly valuable. I will learn from you, and your other huddlers will learn from you as well. So I think that we can all appreciate that food is unpredictable when we live with type 1 diabetes. And the parallel with that in a storm to me is just so clear. So you think about weather, we have weather apps, we have technology to tell us a storm is coming and something that might be happening, but you never really know until you're in it what exactly that's going to look like. Are we going to have a big storm? Is it going to be calm? Is it not even going to show up? My kids tell me all the time that the weatherman is wrong, right? So we don't know until we're there sometimes. And sometimes we don't know what to do once that happens. And I just think that that's exactly what it feels like sometimes when we go to eat. What is going to happen to my blood sugar afterwards? I have no idea. Sometimes I can guess at what might happen, but it ends up being completely different than what I might have expected. So what I hope to do tonight is, yes, I want to share some practical tips and some solutions, but I know that that's not all going to work for all of you. I think probably more importantly, I really want to just reassure you that these things that happen to us are normal, and to understand why some of these things can happen, and hopefully give you even just a couple new things that you can try to use in home and in your daily lives. Okay. So here are my disclosures. I do a lot of work with the different diabetes technology companies. And further to what Caleb said, absolutely, this is information to share tonight, but please talk with your healthcare team when it comes to making adjustments to, especially your insulin and your diabetes management. So over the course of the next hour, let's talk about some of the challenging trends that come with diabetes and different types of foods and different types of meals. Let's talk about some solutions, and let's talk about some things that we can do about it, including a lot of this to do with technology, because there's been a lot of updates and there's a lot of tools that we can use today. But before I get started, I'd like everyone to pop in the chat box. And I want you to share what you feel is the most frustrating piece of managing food with when you have type 1 diabetes. And this could be a specific food, this could be something you feel, this could be what happens to your blood sugar, this could be things your family tries to tell you. Just go ahead. I want to hear what all of you think. Why is it frustrating to talk about food? Why do we sometimes not want to talk to the dietitian, maybe even? Whoops, I jumped ahead here. You can't eat that. Hi, Leanne. I know, Leanne. Don't know the carbs of a certain food when I'm having it. Yep. Unpredictable highs. So frustrating. Go ahead and vent. Time delay. Meals when eating out. What works one day doesn't work another. Absolutely. Being judged. So frustrating. No 2 days are the same, even with the same food. Yep. Eating out. Time delay when carbs hit. Travel and eating new foods. That's really tough. Matching food with insulin timing, traveling, unpredictability. Love Chinese food. Maybe have it 3 times a year, but it's a crazy sugar, like needing 3 shots, even though you think you gave enough. Yep. Unpredictable, so many variables. You guys hit the nail on the head. I can understand every single one of these things. Oh, we're still going. This is amazing. Good sugars for 2 hours after you eat, and then wham. Yep. Yeah. And isn't it amazing how much we've learned about this? I don't know, how many of you have lived with type 1 for many years before the days of CGM? And you would wake up the next morning, you'd go to bed with your blood sugar and target and wake up the next morning with a 20. And it's like, well, where did that come from? I thought I was fine. Right. And now with our CGM, you see where it at least creeped up and we can start to understand a lot. Insulin near bottom of the cartridge working different than a new cartridge. Wow, that's specific. I like it. Stress and highs. Yeah, you guys got it. There's so much that's frustrating when it comes to food and diabetes. It is really hard. That is why I think we had so many people sign up tonight, because this is like, we could spend all day talking about this. So, and I want to acknowledge as well that we have a lot of amazing new technology tools. So this is automated insulin delivery. There's a lot of graphs out here from all of the studies of these new like hybrid closed loop systems. And this green bar, or sorry, not green, this red line here is people using closed loop. And this is time and range on the side here. And if we were to put a line across, 70% time and range is our goal. And what we consistently see with all of these systems is that overnight, an automated insulin delivery system beautifully brings people up into like 80, 90+% time in range. Wonderful. Then guess what happens? People wake up. And what do we do when we wake up? We eat and we move. And so what happens is, oh, sorry, my slide advancer is too quick tonight. What we see happens is that it slowly dips below that 70%. And then for the rest of the day, it's actually really hard to even try to approach that 70% goal time and range. And that is the reality. So when we're trying to strive for some of these glycemic goals, we can get really hard on ourselves. But even with automated insulin delivery, it's really hard to do it. And the answer isn't just to not eat. We want to eat. Eating is a big part of our lives. It's important. So how do we best manage that and cut ourselves some slack a little bit and do the best that we can with what we've been dealt with there? Okay. So what are we looking at? What are we looking at from a blood sugar standpoint with our post-meal, our postprandial metrics? And so now with CGM, you've probably all heard, I just showed it, 70% time in range is ideally what our goal is. And I will absolutely acknowledge that that is very difficult to achieve. There are probably many of you in this group that are saying, how the heck do I get there? Because it does not feel easy, despite that sounding like a nice round number to achieve to. There's probably some of you in this group that are achieving that or that are exceeding it, but it's not an easy thing to do. So that is ideally, if we're getting close to 70%, then we're probably, we're still getting some spikes with our meals because we're not ever getting rid of the very top of this. That's really hard to do. But at what point do we need to worry about how those spikes, are the spikes dangerous? Are they happening too often? So what we want to look at on the left here is, okay, how high are the spikes? These top ones, there's a few little post-meal spikes, but they're fairly short, whereas here's some steeper spikes. And we want to look at how long are they. So these ones here, maybe they're taller than these ones here, but they're going up and they are coming back down to target. So that's a positive thing. And there's some strategies we can try around that. And whereas these ones here are really long sustained highs, and those are really, really frustrating to deal with when you get stuck with one of those. Like some of you articulated, you get this long high that's tough to bring down. And then what we want to know is how often is this happening? And that's where when you look at your CGM printout or your CGM report and you see, okay, how much time above range am I spending? And if it starts creeping up above this 25% high, and especially this very high above 5%, then we know that maybe we can try a couple new strategies. Again, these are goals. These are actually really tricky to achieve. And you could even start by trying to work on one of these. So after today, you go, okay, I want to work on my spikes. And maybe this is sitting quite a bit above 5%, above 13.9. You may not get straight from getting this orange turn to green, But if we can at least maybe work on turning some of this orange to yellow, that's step one. Okay, we don't need to go all the way to green right off the bat. And then let's move on turning some of this yellow into green. It's going to be stepwise, and nothing is easy, as we know with type 1 diabetes. The other metric to look at if you are using a CGM is the coefficient of variation. And that tells us a lot about how much that blood sugar is swinging up and down. And a lot of that is related to food. So if you feel like things are out of whack and feeling a little bit off, chances are that coefficient of variation is above 36%. That's the magic number. As we can bring that down, things should start to feel smoother. So that's another indicator to look at, just to kind of see if you want to get a sense of if the changes you're making are making a difference from a glycemic standpoint. Okay. So this brings us, I guess, to our mealtime insulin dose. So some of the things we're going to talk about here today, we can't, as I said, this is like a full course in and of itself because so many things impact a mealtime insulin dose. Most of us have been taught to count our carbs. That's probably going to be our biggest factor we're going to look at. And we're going to look at what our current glucose is. And that is the biggest part of our decision is based on those two factors. But then we start to think, okay, maybe the protein that I'm eating may impact my glucose after I eat. And also I've been told about high fat. And then, well, maybe the timing that I give my insulin is going to throw things off a bit. Maybe if I've been more or less active, that's going to make a difference. What about the time of day? What about a type of insulin that I'm using is maybe different? Maybe there's something with sugar, the glycemic index, the fiber that's contained in there. You feel stressed, so things don't work the same. Someone else cooked, you're rising, you're dropping, a different food, someone else cooked. Menstrual, like you guys name it, right? All this stuff. It's almost a joke that we try to think that we can handle this every single time that we eat. And it's not surprising that we can feel like this sometimes. This is one of my favorite Robert Munch books. I don't know if you've read Angela's Airplane, but this poor little girl ends up in the cockpit of a plane. And isn't that how it feels when we sit down to eat our meal and there's all of these things that really could be contributing to what that insulin dose should be? And there's definitely days where I feel like I crash and burn afterwards. That's for sure. And I think we know that striving for perfection is probably not realistic, but let's aim to hopefully not crash and burn, but just have maybe a bit of a smoother ride and a bit of a softer landing. That's what I'm hoping for all of us today. I also want to remind you that yes, we want to come up with some strategies to make our dosing go a little bit more smoothly, but we don't want that to take away from what eating is all about, right? I want you to be able to enjoy your meal with your friends, with your family, with your loved ones, with your colleagues, with your coworkers and fellow students. This is what eating is about. It's meant to be a social thing, and we need to make sure that we can find a way to make our diabetes fit into our regular lives and not the other way around. That is so, so, so important. Okay, so let's dive into some common storms that we see happening in that post-meal time period. The first one I'm naming a tornado. Okay, so a tornado is quick and it can do a lot of damage in a very short time period. And so this is what I'm considering that big post-meal spike. Why some of you maybe came today going, I spike really high after I think one of the questions submitted was in the morning, first thing in the morning, with blood sugar goes up. And, we run into an issue where if we increase the insulin and too much, that you end up with a low that can happen later. This is very common with a high glycemic index food. Sometimes it's most common in the mornings where people are a little bit more insulin resistant. It takes a while to get that insulin really going. It could be a delayed meal bolus, or it could be just that insulin's not matching the food quite right. And what can happen here is, especially if it's a food that doesn't have a lot of protein with it, if it's a very strictly quick acting carbohydrate, is that we give the insulin to go with it. It still doesn't catch it, but then a low protein meal is out of the system very, very quickly. So then what happens is the tail of the insulin is still hanging around once the food has been absorbed. And, oops, sorry guys, my mouse again. that tail of insulin is still there, and then you end up with a low. Sometimes it happens later. So that one's really frustrating. The second storm I'm really going to get into today, I'm naming for the sake of this session, the tsunami. And if you know anything about a tsunami, you can see that sometimes the ocean will be actually quite calm before the storm hits. And that's what can happen. Sometimes you have like a pizza meal or a takeout meal and you eat and you take your insulin for it. And within the first hour or so, you're like, oh yeah, I totally nailed it. Things like I'm 5.8 or I'm 6. That was easy. And then a few hours later, boom, up goes that blood sugar. And you're like, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? What did I screw up? Sometimes we say, and it's not us, it's the food. It has that effect on with our high fat and or high protein foods. And so we're going to dive into that one in a little bit here as well. So let's start with this tornado. So this big post-meal spike that's really, really frustrating. And I'd love to hear in the chat box, what foods cause this for you? That post-meal spike. Oatmeal, Chinese food. I'll add mine is breakfast cereal. Pizza, okay. Sushi and Chinese food, breakfast cereal and fruit, white bread and buns. Yep. Oftentimes anything that's sweet or more processed, we tend to see it. First thing in the morning, very, very, very common. Yeah, sushi, granola. Okay, I like it. So the key factors here, when we're talking about that big spike, a lot of this has to do with the quality of the carbohydrate. So as I said, if something more processed is more likely to spike that blood sugar more quickly, or something with a high glycemic index raises that blood sugar much more quickly. So like a white bread versus a whole grain bread. The quantity of carbohydrates, and this is how we count it, but also the amount. So the higher the carb load, the higher the amount of carbohydrates, it's more likely to give a sharper spike. And we've also seen a lot of evidence to really tell us how important the timing of that insulin dose really, really is. And we can see that quite clearly now with our continuous glucose monitors. So let's start with the carb counting. This is really where a lot of our nutrition education has gone. Really, I'd say this big shift happened was insulin pumps came to be much more common kind of in the early 2000s. That transition from using an old meal plan where we were given starches and fruits and food categories to now counting exact grams of carbohydrates. And as carb counting became to be more commonplace, we got very diligent with it, and many of us were probably trained to try to be as precise as we possibly can be with carb counting. And we've now kind of backed off on that a little bit, because what we realize is that we can actually have a decent amount of error in our carb counting and still get an optimal result. So we can be off by up to about 20% and still get an optimal result. And a big reason for that is because, as we showed with all those different variables that I showed at the beginning, there are so many other things that influence that insulin dose beyond just that simple carb count itself. So we can be off a little bit. What we also know is that you don't necessarily have to count in 1 gram increments. So if somebody, Leanne, I know you're out there. So if Leanne is counting in 30, saying this is 37 grams of carbohydrates, and I'm choosing to say I'm going to round it up and put 40 in. I'm going to guesstimate and say it's 40. We could actually both get a pretty good result. It's not to say she's a better carb counter than I am, or I'm a better carb counter than her. It actually doesn't make a big difference. So I don't want you to feel bad if you're not doing that exact carb count, and if you're kind of rounding up, that's okay. We do know that for error, usually the larger meal is a larger error. Okay, that's pretty common. And I think most of us could appreciate that, especially get that big dinner plate. If anyone had a Thanksgiving dinner, it's a little bit trickier to estimate that bigger meal. So we do see error there as well. But probably the most important thing to remind ourselves of is that we do want to make sure we're comfortable estimating, because that's going to be more likely to have us choose those more nutritious whole foods versus feeling like our carb counting has to be perfect and we need to pick something that has a nutrition label on it because that is going to give us that exact carb count. So I always say, hey, it's snack time. I could grab a granola bar and know exactly the carb count, or grab a piece of fruit and have to guess at it. Well, definitely as a dietitian, I'd rather you grab the piece of fruit and take a guess at it. And we know that there's many other things that are influencing that insulin dose anyways. So moral of the story, yes, we want to try our best with our carb counting, but it does not have to be perfect. And that is because, as I just said, that carb counting is just one piece of the puzzle. This picture here, this glycemic profile could have been a perfect carb count, but that insulin just wasn't doing what we wanted it to because of all those other things. And that is such a frustrating thing to be in. But I want to shed a little bit of light on some other things that are contributing to this behind the scenes that maybe you haven't even realized before. So this is a really interesting study that was done where they actually took accurate carb counts, but of different foods, and similar but different foods, and noticed that, hey, guess what? When we give these to people that live with type 1 diabetes, they get very different glucose responses. So the purple one here is a higher protein pasta. The green one here is a regular pasta. And the blue one here is white rice. And what you can see is I would have guessed that the high protein pasta would have had the smoother glucose profile, but actually the two pastas were quite comparable. And it was the white rice that had a much sharper spike in that post-meal time period. So you can see this is the glucose, it rises and it stays high longer. So overall, higher glucose result. So if all we were talking about was carb counting, then they'd be like, well, what did I do wrong? And it was just that that food gave a different glycemic response than the other food. And that is a reality, okay? Also, what's interesting is we can take, okay, what if we take the same food and we have it in different amounts? So this study here took 4 test breakfasts. It was all the same pancake recipe. They were pancakes. And they rotated giving people these different amounts. So they got 20 grams one day, 50 grams one day, 100 or 150. And then they looked at that to say, okay, how are they going to respond differently to it? This is a bit of a busy looking graph, but it is interesting. So what you can see is that those that had, when they had the 20-gram option, it actually had the most time in range. So they went up a little bit and they were pretty stable. The 50 and the 100 grams, so the green and the green and the turquoise, they were similar at the beginning, but both of those ones, they actually ended up with more lows. And then the really large portion with 150 grams, they ended up with the highest peak later on, the delayed rise from that one. And so the moral of the story from this study was that, hey, guess what? If you count your carbs and you use a carb ratio, that carb ratio may not actually work as well for every amount of carbohydrate you have. So if I usually have around, I don't know, let's say 30 to 50 grams of carbs for lunch and I have a carb ratio that works nicely, if I have 100 grams of carbs one day because I'm going out for lunch and I think I counted it to a T, I may not get the same response. And so it's just that the science we have is not perfect. And I do think that this is where we've really, things have really swung. So back when I was a kid diagnosed with diabetes, I had a meal plan. And I think some of you had it, and it was every day at lunch. I could tell you it was 3 starches, 2 fruits, and 2 proteins, right? And at the same time every day, I ate roughly the same amount of carbohydrate, and I fine-tuned my insulin towards that. And now I think it's wonderful that we allow some flexibility, but when we eat outside of what we typically eat, our insulin just may behave a little bit differently. And so that's just an understanding of why sometimes that feels unpredictable from day to day. Okay. All right. So probably the biggest trend that's happened in the recent years is we've gone, okay, we can see that carbs are challenging to deal with. Why don't we just get rid of them? Let's just choose not to eat carbohydrates. Then we don't have to count them. Let's eat other foods. And this is absolutely a massive, massive trend that a lot of people are realizing. Again, I think because we see these spikes on our CGMs and I go, I don't want to have to deal with this. Let's get rid of the carbs. And there's a lot of people who've talked very positively about the effects of this. I will always give credit. Adam Brown is, a wonderful advocate in the type 1 diabetes space. And he had this huge epiphany that, hey, if I eat less than 30 grams of carbs at a time, my diabetes is way easier to manage. He's not saying he's not eating any carbs, but just by having that smaller amount of carbohydrate, his glucose profile really, really flattened out. He's doing other things as well. Like he's a big advocate of postprandial exercise and other things also. So I don't think that's just low carb alone, but it was a complete and total game changer for him. And for some people, that really, really is. But sometimes there could be drawbacks to this as well. So we know that fat and protein are going to affect the glucose profile as well. And many people on your healthcare team have maybe gone, well, a little bit leery. What are the potential risks of using a low carb diet? So actually, just earlier this year, the Better Registry out of Quebec, they have a large group of people with type 1 that they follow, and they decided to take a look at a large group of them and group them by how much carbohydrate they eat. So the lowest carb, moderate carb, high carb, and very high carb, based on kind of their diet recalls. And so what they found is that those with the lowest carbohydrate intake, and this isn't keto, okay? I think they were still in around like the I want to say it's 160 grams of carbs. So it was still carbohydrate, just not really high carb. What they found was that for those people on that lower carb intake, they were more likely to reach their target A1C. So it did, in fact, help their blood glucose levels for sure. But it did come at the consequence of worsening their diet quality. So what they found was that the first one doesn't surprise me, fewer fruits and fewer grain products. Those are higher carb, more milk, more meats, and a higher intake of all types of fat. So that is something to be mindful of, that, hey, if we are going to switch to go into a lower carb intake, or we want to cut some of those carbs back, what are we replacing them with? And if the answer is charcuterie, right, meat and cheese and all of those things that are higher in those animal fats, especially, we do worry about cardiovascular health in the long run, especially in the diabetes world. So if we can be proactive and go, okay, I'm thinking I want to back off on my carbs a bit, it's easier to manage my diabetes with fewer carbs. What could I choose instead? And because you're going to be hungry, you still need fuel for your body. So can you have more nuts and seeds and plant-based proteins, and just have things ready on hand to reach for to replace those carbohydrates for sure. Okay. On the positive side, though, thankfully, the other thing they found is that there wasn't really any change in their risk of lows. Their awareness of lows was still okay, and their cholesterol and lipid profiles were actually all okay at this point in time. So we don't have long-term data, but in the short term, they were all okay. So that's positive. They also did find, though, that across everybody living with type 1 diabetes, everyone had lower intake of fiber, higher intake of fat, and higher intake of saturated fat. So I do think that I'm not surprised by that, because managing food and diabetes is hard as it is. We're just trying to figure out how to match our insulin to our food most of the time, that sometimes we're not as caught up maybe in, or I guess we can't forget about the nutritional value of the food that we're eating as well. Okay. All right. So let's now talk about insulin timing. So this is something that I know that this group has talked about, and you've probably even seen a graph like this, but this is such an important discussion. So we know that giving that bolus in advance makes an incredible difference, and I would argue that this is probably more important than getting the carb count accurate, getting that timing right, because our insulin is really, really slow. And if you were around when rapid-acting insulin came on the market, we thought it was so fast when it first came out, but it really isn't, right? It takes at least 15 minutes for that insulin just to start working. And what you can see here is that if you give your insulin, the red line here is people giving their insulin right at the start of when they're eating. So you sit down and give your insulin. Now, there was a long time I thought that was good enough. Hey, if we can get it in as we're eating or right at the start of the meal, we're doing really well. But that glucose spiked nearly as much as those that gave that insulin 20 minutes after they ate. Where we really saw a difference was the people that gave their insulin 20 minutes before they ate. And that's where they were really able to stay below that line of 10 that is our goal. And so that makes a huge difference. Now, this can be really, really challenging to do in practice, but it's probably the most impactful thing that you can do. I have a question in the chat here from Aileen about Fiasp and Lumjev. So those are our ultra rapid acting insulins that do work faster. And so for those, you can imagine this curve being shifted forward by about 15 minutes. So with those, they are saying that you can take the insulin at the start of the meal. It is going to depend on what the food is, though. Okay, for something like a breakfast cereal, you might still need to pre-bolus. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is that if you are using an ultra rapid acting insulin, watch your CGM. That is going to be your best guide, and with different types of foods to see where it fits with that. And Faith has a question, which is exactly where I'm going. Well, what about what's your glucose at? That is my next question. So in this study, you can see they're kind of starting out between 8 and 9. But we don't know, like, what if their glucose was higher? What if their glucose was lower? What if they were rising? What if they were falling? We have all this data at our fingertips now, right? So that is where I'm going to take us next. So I'm going to give some amazing credit to the wonderful John Pemberton, who's a dietitian who also lives with type 1 over in the UK. And he's really gotten deep into this because he's noticed that this makes a really, really big difference in the families that he works with. So this is a very detailed table, so I'm going to talk you through it and see what your thoughts are on it. And feel free to agree to disagree. This is a tool that may work for some of you and maybe not for all of you. But what they're saying here is, okay, if this is Samuel and he's 7.9, he's about to give his bolus, he's 7.9 and flat, then yes, this 20-minute pre-bolus fits this chart well. He's with it, he's in range, he's flat, 20 minutes. Now, if he was eating something, let's say low glycemic index, or he doesn't tend to rise when he eats, that might not work for him. So I do definitely have a note here, like adapt this based on what your patterns are. But if you're someone who tends to rise after you eat, that 20-minute pre-bolus is probably what most of you may need. Now, is that going to work if his glucose the next day is 17 before he eats? Because as I told you, that 15 minutes is just getting the insulin starting to work. So if he was 17 and he gave his insulin 20 minutes before, that insulin's just starting to work as he's starting to eat, and then he's eating and it's rising it more. So chances are his blood sugar is going to end up 20. And he's going to say, well, that didn't work. I don't want to do that anymore. That was a useless strategy for me. So in this situation, they're actually saying, hey, if your blood sugar is above 14, you may actually need to give that insulin close to 40 minutes before you eat. Now, if giving that insulin close to 40 minutes before you eat isn't going to work for you that day, I completely understand, but hopefully that at least explains to you why you may get the result that you got and why that 20-minute pre-bolus maybe didn't work that day. But I do think that this is a very useful thing, even if you can just remember, okay, 20 minutes if I'm in range, 30 minutes if I'm a bit high, 40 minutes if I'm quite high, if I'm above 14. And that now maybe changes my behavior a bit. Okay, so I'm cooking dinner, something's about to go in the oven for half an hour. Take a glance at your glucose and hey, oh my gosh, I'm 12. Okay, well, I can actually give my insulin now. And then when the timer goes off and dinner's done, I'm at my 30 minutes and I'm good to go. So just kind of getting yourselves in that proactive thinking can really make a big difference. And we do have to train our minds to this a lot though. But to me, this is easier than having to deal with that really annoying high that hits later. And this may not be practical all of the time, but think of the meals that are predictable and maybe start there. So I'm going to put up on the screen here. This is the QR code for John's website, The Glucose Never Lies, and it takes you straight into a more in-depth explanation of that strategy. And he's got videos of himself doing this and whatnot. So I can put that link in the chat at the end as well. But very, very excellent information on there. He's got charts on all sorts of things actually on that website. It's really, really well done. Good information. Okay. So in reality, yes, we're all saying I need to pre-bolus, but I totally get it that it doesn't always happen. And this is me. This happens to me more than once a week for sure. Life is busy. So what other strategies could we try? So go ahead and pop those in the chat box. What else could you do if you missed the pre-meal bolus? And while you guys are typing those in, I think I've got a question from Narm.
Oh, hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm okay. Had a good day today, so I feel good.
Wonderful.
Okay, so you know what I've done, and I know it defeats the purpose of having 780 G. So when my blood sugar is at the low level,
Yep.
I take half my insulin 10 minutes to 15 minutes prior. I don't take the whole thing,
Yep.
half carbs, right? And then then I would look at in an hour and see where I'm going, right?
Yep.
Or half an hour, even a half hour, right?
Yep.
And then I take the rest of it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And if that works for you, that's a perfect strategy, right? You've kind of learned how to go, okay, I don't want the full thing, but I need to get something kind of working. I think that's a wonderful strategy. Thank you for sharing. And actually, I want to go back to this for a second because I remembered now I had a pre-submitted question of someone saying, well, what if you're low? Okay, so in the lower end, they're saying like if you're kind of between 4 and 6, and I get it that the fours are kind of dicey for some people. Maybe you'll say 4.5 and up, kind of depending on your comfort zone. Again, it takes 15 minutes for that insulin to just even barely start working. So then you may back down to 15 minutes. If you're actually low going into your meal, though, please treat your low before you go to eat. I think a common thing, and I've done this where I'm like, oh, I'm low. I'm just going to eat as fast as I can and try and get my blood sugar up. And what happens, who's done that? I don't know if anyone can raise their hand. What happens is our meal, guess what? It's a mixed meal. It's not fast-acting carbohydrate, and it takes forever to bring the blood sugar up. And then we overeat, and then we don't feel good, and our digestion is slowed down. So the other thing that happens when our blood sugar is low is our gastric emptying is different. So we're more likely to get a big rebound high later. What we're best to do is treat that low, let that blood sugar stabilize, then go into our meal if we can afford the time for that. Okay, that's ideal. Okay, so back to our strategy. So pre-bolusing we want to try to do. Sometimes it doesn't happen. I saw some wonderful, wonderful suggestions in here. I'm going to go back here. So someone said, exercise. Yes, great one. Start your meal eating your salad and protein. That's a very valid, there's even a study that was done on this on food orders. So, hey, why don't I eat the carbs at the end? And that's buying you some time. And it's also by putting some protein and some fat into your system, that's going to slow that digestion a bit as well. Walking after your meal absolutely makes a big difference. Veggies first, using a temp basil, depending on what their BG is. Yeah, that's a great one. Watch blood glucose carefully after dinner and perhaps take more if you're starting to spike. Definitely an option. So I think you guys got all the ones I talked about. If you have time to delay the meal, why not? Sometimes that doesn't work, especially if it's a hot meal, but add protein or fat. If you have the ability to switch any of the food for something like breakfast, if it's a grab and go, choose a lower glycemic option or maybe a little less carbs. That's something that I've done sometimes. I'm like, okay, I'm going to have a little more salad and a little less potatoes tonight because I didn't pre-bolus. So if I have the option to adjust my intake, I will. Food order I talked about and exercise, and also give yourself permission to just try again next time. It's okay. We're not after perfection all of the time. Okay, good suggestions. Okay, so let's move into our second storm now, which is our tsunami caused by our high fat, our high protein foods that can be so frustrating to deal with. So I want to hear from all of you. When we're talking high fat, high protein, I can take a guess at some of the food types that are going to come out, but let's see if you can surprise me. What foods send you to that, you get that immediate, not so bad, and then boom, up it spikes several hours later. Pizza, yes. Oh, risotto. What a great comment. Yes, risotto might do that too. French fries, steak, lasagna, pizza, sushi. Yep, you guys got it. Okay, so these high fat, high protein meals, why do they do this for us? So what the fat component is doing is it's the part that's responsible for potentially that lower delaying that rise to begin with, because it's delaying our gastric emptying. think we can all relate that when we have a high-fat meal, you can almost feel that meal sitting in the pit of your stomach for several hours later because that digestion slows down. And so it may actually slow things down to begin with, and then you get this high later, and you can actually get insulin resistance from that high-fat component to the meal. The protein in large amounts, even just alone, can cause that delayed late rise in that glucose. And that is a combination of mechanisms how that happens. Part of that is the liver actually putting out more glucagon, so that stored glucose getting slowly released. And some of that is from glucose being made actually from the protein itself. So when we put the two of these together, we get that what we thought was an unpredictable delayed rise, and that gets stuck. It's a stubborn high that gets stuck around later. Really, really frustrating to deal with. And what we know is that it's an additive effect between the two of them. So if you want to feel like you're not the only one, I think all the people talking in the chat makes you now realize, okay, I'm not the only one that experiences this. But here's a study back, like we've known this for quite a while now. This is a 2013 study. You can see a low fat, low protein meal, the glucose is the lowest. Once it's high protein, it's up a bit higher. High fat alone is up a bit higher. But when you put the high fat and high protein together, they double up on each other. It's an additive effect, and you end up with this 3 to 5 hours stubborn high that happens afterwards. And that's if you correct it. That could last all night if we didn't catch it before we went to bed, let's say. So some of the strategies that we can try around this is we can consider using additional insulin, whether you're on a pump or an MDI. If you're on a pump, there's an extended bolus option. CGM is wonderful for, giving us that alert and letting us know we need to give a correction. I'm going to talk a bit at the end about automated insulin delivery. And then the blue box is just the truth of really where a lot of this is it's, okay, what happened? What can I do differently next time? And just continuing to try, because there's no one answer that fits everybody. That's 100% true. Okay. So the extended bolus, if you're on an insulin pump, now this is going to be I'm going to do the automated systems at the end, and even if you're on injections, I want you to listen through this part carefully, because I'm going to show you how you can do this on injections as well. Okay. So with an extended bolus, or you may call it a dual wave bolus if you're on a Medtronic pump, the idea is we're splitting the insulin dose. So you can give part of the insulin up front like you would with an injection, but then the remainder is going to trickle in over however long you set that extended bolus duration for. And so that is what we're trying to use to cover that delayed absorption we get with high fat and that delayed effect of protein as well. And probably one of the most common questions I get is, okay, well then how do I split it? Do you go 50-50, 70-30, 30-70? What is the best option for this? And there really isn't one best option for this, because it depends on the type of meal you're eating, how many carbs are in it, if it's low carb, high carb. Each person has a very unique response to fat and protein, so that is going to be different. And as we all know, no one day with diabetes is ever the same. So even what worked last Friday night might not work this Friday night. But there are some general themes that are common. So this study really set out to try to figure this out. And what they found was that most people needed at least 60% of that bolus given right away initially. Because if people pull back on that first split of the bolus too much, then they ended up spiking. And then you spend those next 3, 4, 5, 6 hours chasing that high, and you're just as frustrated in the end. So we ideally want at least 60% of that insulin up front, and then up to 70% of the insulin given over the extended time period. Now, if you think I have my math wrong, that's exactly what this looks like, because this actually adds up to more than 100%. So this supports the idea that we actually don't just need to split the insulin, but because that effect of that delayed high, we actually need to give additional insulin beyond what we would normally count the carbs for. Okay, so that's where this idea kind of first really started to come out. I'm going to show you one more study, if you can bear with me here. So here's some youth taking a high-fat, high-protein breakfast, and they did exactly what this previous study showed. They gave 60% at the mealtime, and then the remainder 40% over the next 3 hours. And they still gave it 15 minutes before they eat. Okay, this is still a pre-bolus. And then what they did is they said, okay, we're going to give 100% of the dose. We're either going to add 20% on, add 40% on, or add 60% on. And what they found was that the magic number here was the 140, the red line, because this one here got the glucose low enough without dropping these people low too much. So it was about 40% extra insulin that people needed in order to manage that high fat, high protein meal. Now, if you're on multiple daily injections, there is a way to absolutely mimic this. So if you tend to get a low right after something like a pizza meal because the fat is slowing down the absorption, you may consider dropping that initial injection that you're giving for the meal. So like they were saying, around 60% seemed to work well for a lot of those people. And again, for you, kind of give and take a little bit. But then you could consider giving a second dose later in order to mimic what I just showed you was happening with that pump. So in this study here, this is the red line here, and I know we're getting tight for time, so I'm just going to get your attention to the red line, because what they did, the magic bullet was at 3 hours, they gave 30% extra insulin, and that was enough to kind of curb the highs. So the black line was when they did nothing. They were able to minimize that high without causing a low blood sugar. When they just added the extra insulin on with the meal, that's the green here, that was when they unfortunately ended up with some lows. So when they split it up and gave that extra shot, it actually worked out quite well. So the moral of the story here is when, you know, you're getting into that high fat, high protein, and the numbers in the research kind of say more than 30 grams of fat. That's a Big Mac, if that gives you perspective. So more than 30 grams of fat, or maybe not super high fat, but moderately high fat plus high protein, then that's when we need to make an adjustment. Now, not many of us are going to sit and count grams of fat and grams of protein. So my rule of thumb is it cheesier, gooier, saucier, deep fried? Does it feel like it's higher in fat, higher in protein than what you normally eat? And if that's the case, that's your signal. Hey, I think I might need to do something different. If you're not sure, watch your CGM and see and say, okay, I did go high when I had that. Someone had a question about a donair and it went, okay, that must have been high fat, high protein because I got that rise 3 hours later, 4 hours later. So maybe I need to try this. And then, as I said, we often need extra insulin and given over an extended time period. Now, those studies showed many people needed close to 40% more insulin. I'm not going to tell you to go home and give 40 units of or 40% more insulin right now. Start slow. So you just go up incrementally and keep watching your glucose and testing and document it, write it down, and talk with your care team until you kind of get that in that golden zone or as close as you can. Okay. And then also is that extended bolus, as I said, make sure you're giving more than half. So they found in that study 60% upfront. The final little caveat with this is just be a little wary, especially if you're using like a 25 or a 30% increase. That's going to be different if you're having low versus high carbs. So be aware of that. And just make sure that your ratios and your insulin settings are all working. Also, please be very, very careful with adding extra insulin for food if you're exercising. So let's say you have some type of a tournament weekend or a ski weekend, something you're really active with, and or if there's alcohol involved, because both of those do cause a low blood sugar, especially late into the night and early into the next morning. We want to be very, very careful about adding in extra insulin in those types of situations, okay? So yes, use your CGM as a guide, like 100%. I could try to give you ideas, but you need to look at your own patterns and take those into your care team. When you go to your next clinic appointment, these are the kinds of things you really can get. It's very valuable to get a second set of eyes on and talk through some examples. So I know we're getting close to the end here, Caleb. I have some things on automated delivery, but I wonder if I should just save those for the question period. Just because I don't want to cut people off on time and I don't know what systems everyone's using. Is that reasonable?
Yeah,
Can do that.
sounds great.
Okay, so don't be too hard on yourselves though, guys. So there's a lot of information in there. I could have kept going. But so kind of moral of the story, if you get that post-meal spike, think about the quality of the carbohydrate, how much carbohydrate, how are we counting it, and really, really pay attention to that bolus timing, probably the most important. high fat, high protein, I just summarized for you. So consider more insulin over more time. And then we can do some AID questions here, but really like cut yourself some slack. This stuff is hard. I'm a dietitian and I spike after I eat on a regular basis because it's really, really challenging to deal with this stuff. So celebrate the successes when you get them, but and don't be afraid to try something new. Okay. So I'll open that up for questions.
Amazing. Thank you very much for such an informative presentation. It's really valuable hearing your insights as a person living with T1D. So I think I speak for all of us when I say we appreciate it. Before we get into the topics here in the chats, I'll just go through our pre-submitted questions. I know that you tried to answer most of it in the presentation, so we'll still go over everyone, but may only skim over the topics that were already covered. And then we'll open it up here for the people in the chat, or if they want to speak up on Zoom. But our first one here was from Reminder, and it says, my numbers spike after anything I eat, especially after lunch. Any suggestions?
Yeah, so you get that big spike. So I'd be curious about the bolus timing, right? And oftentimes I find like I said, we think, okay, if I bolus a bit before I eat, it's going to make a difference. But often we need even that little bit more of a kickstart. And going from 5 minutes before you eat to 20 minutes before you eat feels like a lot, but it makes a huge difference. Really, really big difference. Also, make sure your insulin is set properly. I've seen many times people that their basal and bolus insulin are not balanced. So if your basal is say really high and you kind of are relying on that basal insulin to partially cover your meals, then that bolus can never be strong enough. You have to have a pretty small bolus. Otherwise, it's going to cause you to crash. So I would definitely look at or talk with your care team about taking a closer look at your basal bolus balance as well.
Excellent. Our next one here is also to do with those spikes. It's from Susie. It says, desperate for practical tips to stop the spike. We get it every breakfast, even with pre-bolus, yet at breakfast there is always a big spike. Today to 15, even with protein. If we increase the carb ratio, her sugar goes low to 2 to 3 hours later.
Yeah.
So just looking on the options to stop the spike again.
Totally. So if breakfast is constantly a battle, you could take the pre-bolus even earlier. I know people who go even sooner than the 20 minutes for breakfast. The other thing too is if that's a battle and that's not a reality, then it's maybe choosing the breakfast choice. That is one meal I hear a lot of people doing the lower carb options for because they're just so resistant to getting that insulin working first thing in the morning. So that a lower carb option for breakfast could be a good option as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And this next one is from David. And I know that you mentioned it as well in the presentation with the donair, but it's how to know when to take extended bolus or extra insulin using pens for meals. So they recently encountered a problem eating donair. They took insulin for the meal and sugars were perfect up to 1.5 hours after the meal. And then they surprisingly started to spike. They tried eating another donair a week later and encountered these same problems. They stopped eating them as they take the same amount of insulin for the pre-meal bolus as they do for the post-meal.
Yeah. So I'd say don't stop eating the donair if you enjoyed the donair. So you notice the pattern after having it twice, right? And sometimes I give things twice, but now it's instead of being surprised by it, expect it, right? Anticipate what that meal is going to cause and beat it to it and say, okay, so if you're on injections, then you could say, okay, every time after I have that, I'm rising. So 2 hours after, I'm going to give a little bit of extra insulin and try and start with small and then work your way up until you can figure out what actually works for you. Set an alarm. I love how we all have smart devices now because it is so easy to grab your smartphone or your smartwatch and set a 2-hour timer and say, I'm going to see what's happening and I'm going to do something about it before I'm 16. I'm going to do something about it when I see it's 11 or 12 and rising. So definitely play around with that. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Excellent. Our next one here is another kind of specific one around food. It's from Anonymous, and it says, how do we assess the carb count of a single serving of a casserole that they make?
Oh, that's hard, right? I know, but you're eating something that's homemade, right? So I go back to something like a casserole. If it's pasta or rice based, go back to the basics of, okay, it's pasta casserole, 1 cup of pasta, is roughly 30 grams of carbs, roughly. All right, that's like a fist, or that's so imagine that in your brain if that was plain pasta. And then I might say, okay, maybe this is 2 cups. And kind of, I think I find it easiest to think in like 15-gram increments. I think it's because I grew up on a meal plan. And, but then I go, okay, this might be 2 fists. So that's like 60. Oh, but there's a bunch of protein and vegetables in there. So maybe I'll take a bit off of that. Maybe I'll go 45. Right. And so you have to kind of wing it and break it down a little bit, but don't be afraid to guess and go for it. Right. Enjoy that homemade meal. Try and if you have the recipe, jot down what you bolused on your recipe so that next time you can know if that worked or not, and adapt. Yeah.
Amazing. Great.
That helped.
Our next one here, and I'm now thinking about that chart you showed again that has all of the different blood glucoses and times, but it's from Dave and it says a strategy for eating at dinner or lunch starting low-ish.
Yeah, starting lowish. So that was exactly that strategy. So if you're truly in that hypoglycemia, you're 4 and under, then I would do a treatment of the low first and then have your meal. Try and get it up. So if you're going into lunch, it's such a good habit to get into looking in that CGM before you sit down at the table. Right. So I always think about it in the morning, I'm getting ready. Before I step on the stairs to go downstairs for breakfast, I better have looked at where I'm at because I maybe needed to bolus sooner than I thought, or at least have an idea of where I'm sitting. So same thing, you smell dinner cooking, have a sense of where you're at. So it's okay, do I need a little bit of fast acting carb before I step into that dinner meal? But if you are kind of in that like 5-ish range, let's say, then you can do a 15-minute bolus ahead of time. You may need to work up to that if you're nervous about it and prove yourself that you can. So maybe you'll start with 10 and you'll go, oh, I was fine. Right. And then you go, okay, maybe I'm going to try 15. So you don't have to do everything quickly. You can work it up slowly if you're not comfortable.
Great. Thank you. Our next one here is from Julie. It says, I've successfully used fast-acting Fiasp insulin for over 2 years, but currently find I'm getting low blood sugars after dinner about an hour after eating. I take my insulin about 10 minutes before I eat. I believe that is because my digestion process has slowed down as I age. Can you recommend a solution to this issue, please?
Yeah. So that one there, if the low is 1 hour after you're eating, so if you're kind of within that first 90 minutes, that's where your insulin is peaking. It could actually be that the insulin dose is too strong for you, right? So that might be something worth considering adjusting a dose potentially after. Talk to your care team about that and see if that's now too much insulin for you. Because usually that's our indicator is if the low is in the first 1 to 2 hours after the meal, it's often that the insulin dose was too much. And on the tail end, it's kind of, if it's continuing to rise or fall later, then we look bigger picture.
Great. We just got 3 more here. One of the first one is, can you explain the basics of when to bolus for different types of foods? So like protein versus carbs.
Yeah, and again, that is such a tough one. So most of your carb containing meals, like the chart that I showed you from John Pemberton, I would adjust it. It's a carbohydrate containing meal, really adjusting that bolus timing really more based on where your glucose is at and what your trend arrow is at. For something that's a protein only meal, I did not get into dosing for protein alone. But as I said, like that protein will eventually cause the glucose to rise and stay high, but it's delayed. It's kind of 3 to 5 hours later, most commonly. So I would look at your pattern, and if you tend to eat a protein only meal and you see that you rise at 3-4 hours after you eat, look at where your rise is and consider putting your dose just ahead of that. And you're again going to start slow and work your way up. I hope that helps. That's tough to give a quick answer on. It really takes looking at an individual's reports to see that. But look back on your data, guys. You all, I would believe that many of you have a lot of glucose data and go back and look at it. It tells us a lot.
Our next one here is from Anonymous. It says, my numbers go up significantly high regardless what I eat, and I crash every day.
That's frustrating. To me, that sounds like that basal bolus insulin I was answering the other question may be a little bit off, right? If you have again, that example of too much basal insulin working in the background, that is going to pull the glucose down between meals and lead to a lot of those lows and that crash later. But then you can't give a really strong bolus to stop a spike because you got all this basal hanging around in the background. So it could be that, or it could be the other way around, right? So I'd really get someone to take a look at the balance of your insulin doses for sure. Those need refining often. And sometimes we think, hey, I can take the same dose for years, and it doesn't always work so
Great,
well
thank
anymore.
you. And our last one here is another one to do with those annoying post-breakfast spikes. It says they always have post-breakfast meal spikes, just started pumping again and really frustrated.
Post-breakfast spikes. Oh, isn't breakfast hard, guys? So try that bolus timing. Keep backing the bolus up and keep an eye on it. Write it down. Write it down. Put yourself on like a 1 week challenge and say, okay, I'm going to try a 20-minute pre-bolus and let's see what happens. And write it down and see what happens. You may need to go even earlier potentially. Be curious to see that. And then like if you can add in any protein or fat, that's going to make a difference. And again, as I mentioned, sometimes lower carb can really help with a breakfast meal.
Great, thank you. That is it for our pre-submitted, but I do see that there was one that's already in the chat that Nilu put in it. It's a question from Steve, so I'll read that one out for you as well. It says, I'm on multiple daily injections, Basaglar in the morning, and then add either Admilog or Fiasp to start the day. Then, depending on when you are going to eat or have had a meal, which has spiked your glucose, what's the wisdom of using either Fiasp or Admilog pre or post meal? I don't mean to mix them together, but rather choose one or the other depending on timing and meal.
Yeah, good question. So I would say Fiasp is our faster acting one. So anything that's higher in carb or a lower glycemic index, that Fiasp is going to act faster on. So when you could use the perk of something working faster, most of our meals, if you eat carbohydrate, causes to spike quite a bit, and that Fiasp will definitely help you stay ahead of it. Where the only time you could run into problems if you have something very low glycemic index, or let's say you have a very heavy protein or heavy fat meal, it's really slow, that causes a slow rise, you may find that Fiasp is too quick. And so for that, your Admilog might work a little bit more nicely because it is slower to start out. It's really that first 15 minutes that's the real big difference though. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I know that we're just kind of at the end of our time here. I'm not sure what timing is looking like for you. I thought that I would just open it up quickly to see if anyone wanted to speak up in the chat or put something in the text box on the side there. But once again, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, I'm happy to kick around here for a bit. So if some of you want to go and some want to stick around with more questions, I'm happy to do that.
Awesome. Great. We'll leave it open.
Anyone still hanging around, I'd love to hear what strategy you're going to go home to try.
Oh, I see one in the chat here that's come through. It's thank you. How should you bolus for a liquid diet?
Ooh, that's a tough one. You may need to go sooner with your bolus. If you're finding you're rising really quick, it's going to absorb more quickly. Anytime something's liquid versus solid. So watch your glucose doesn't lie. It really doesn't. Watch what happens if you're continuing to spike. Just keep backing it up a little bit more.
Great.
I love that people are excited about the timing of the insulin shots. That's so true. I primarily work with pumps, and the pump world has gotten so much attention for how to split boluses and whatnot, and it's not talked about enough for people on injections.
Oh, here, and there's a follow-up to that question from the same person. It says, should the pre-bolus be extended for liquid diet, for example, apple juice? So I think they're referring to like those sick days where you can't get those carbs in and have to substitute it with having those liquids.
Totally. So if it depends if you're sipping it or if it's going down quickly. If it's a slow sip and you're not sure how much you're actually getting, but if you're going to be having it over 15 minutes like a meal, then you should be able to But be cautious, especially with a sick day. The last thing we want is for you to go low.
Great. They said, got it. Thank you. Lovely
Leanne,
answer.
remembering I'm a diabetic, I had to take my insulin before I eat. No.
Just saw that. I was like, that is me. So whenever when you get so wrapped up in what you're cooking, and then you're like, well, now the meal's hot and ready to go, but I have to
Oh.
take insulin and get settled for this.
I think
Get
that when the
carried
dental,
away.
I think when the dental industry figures out how to get everyone to floss, they will have the answer for how to get those of us with diabetes how to pre-bolus, right? It's not always easy. Even if you could do one, like think of what meal is the most routine, right? Yeah.
It's like if I just, when I took stuff out of the fridge, if I could just remember to bolus then, that would even just be something.
I know. I'm with you. I'm with you.
Me too.
Flossing is so hard. Thank you, Bob.
Yes,
Right?
Bob. I
Yeah.
hear you.
I think the dentists understand, just like us, right?
Okay, I will go through. It looks like we're good for our questions here, but I'll just go through some closing remarks and put the feedback forms and everything in the chat. So, um, once again, thank you so much for joining us this huddle and sharing your knowledge and expertise on such an important topic. I'm already excited to go and try things out. Stay tuned for next month's huddle, who is with an ophthalmologist. We are still waiting on just selecting a date there, and we are continuously working on improving the huddle sessions, and we'd love to hear from you. So if you have 5 minutes to spare, please consider filling out the short feedback survey linked in the chat. We look at every single comment, and your suggestions help shape the huddle. If you have trouble accessing the survey, you can also contact our huddle coordinator, Lena, who has been sending you emails. Thank you again to everyone who attended tonight. We really hope you enjoyed the session. And thank you so much, Alanna. That was amazing. I really enjoyed every bit of that. And again, I'm excited to incorporate it all into my next meal there. I'll also add the website that you had meant the glucose never lies. The link is there as well. I just put it in there in case anyone wants to have a look.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great website. There's like really cool exercise strategies on there as well. Yeah, really good stuff.
Awesome.
Thanks, Leanne. Sorry I picked on you tonight.
All good anytime. You know you can.